Welcome to the first episode of our special series ahead of the general election. My name is Kazim, and I'm a researcher here at the Community Policy Forum, an independent think tank seeking to promote evidence-based and community-centered approaches to policymaking surrounding the structural inequalities facing Muslim communities here in the UK. Over the coming days, we'll be bringing you exclusive interviews with candidates from across the political spectrum. Our goal is to provide in-depth insights and diverse perspectives on the key issues shaping this election, especially those issues pertaining to British Muslim communities. We'll hear directly from candidates themselves about their and where applicable their party's policies, visions for the future, and how they plan to address the concerns of voters like you. Whether you're still undecided or just want to learn more about where each candidate and each party stands, this series will offer valuable information to help you make an informed decision on election day. So let's dive in. Today, we're pleased to be joined by Andrew Feinstein, an independent candidate running in the London seat of Holborn and St Pancras, which is currently held by the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer. Andrew has lived in Camden for over 22 years. He served in his native South Africa as an MP in Nelson Mandela's government and led the ANC component of the Public Accounts Committee. He's been a lifelong anti-war and anti-racism activist who stood with Mandela against apartheid in South Africa and is a vocal supporter of the Palestinian people. He speaks at local schools on issues of racism because, as the son of a Holocaust survivor, he believes that all racism and all discrimination is reprehensible. Thank you so much, Andrew, for taking time out of what is no doubt a busy campaigning schedule to join us today. So, Andrew, a large majority of British Muslims consider Palestine to be the most significant issue in this general election. What is your perspective on this matter?
I think that's exactly right. I think we're at a moment of existential crisis, both in the world and in our politics in Britain. And I think one of the primary reasons for that is obviously what is happening in Gaza. I write about and investigate the global arms trade. So I spend an enormous amount of my time, and have for the last 22 plus years, focused on conflict, on international law, on genocide, on war crimes. And I never imagined that in my lifetime we would see a situation where a genocide was happening on our screens every day in real time. And it's not just that our senior politicians are doing nothing about it. It's far worse than that. They're actually enabling, facilitating, arming, and profiting from the genocide in Gaza. And I think it's incredibly important that people understand that this is being done in our names with our tax pounds. And so not only is it British weapons, the manufacture of which has been subsidized by the British taxpayer, that are being used to slaughter over 40,000 people so far, the majority of them women and children, in Gaza and to a much lesser extent the West Bank. But we need to remind ourselves that in the year 2024, we still have a system of apartheid operating in the world. We still have a brutal and illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories. And as someone who worked under Nelson Mandela, who fought against apartheid, who has spent my entire life fighting against discrimination of every sort, I find this truly, truly terrifying. The fact that over 76% of Britons have wanted a ceasefire for months and months, and our politicians have simply ignored that and acted as though we, the vast majority of people in this country, don't count, is extraordinary to me. And so I think that this election has to ask our politicians the following questions. Why are we prepared to support the state of Israel uncritically in a manner that has not only enabled this genocide, but has also led to the corruption of our own politics? And why do I say that? And I know this isn't a popular thing to say publicly, but I believe that the Saudi Arabian and the Israeli lobbies are the two most moneyed and most influential political lobbies on the planet today. We sell weapons to Saudi Arabia that have been used in possible war crimes and the commission of atrocities in Yemen for over 9.5 years. And of course, we continue to sell weapons to Israel. I believe that the export of these weapons from Britain is illegal in terms of British law, as they increase the likelihood of civilian casualties. And obviously, they are in violation of myriad international laws and treaties, including the International Arms Trade Treaty. But finally, let me just say, I think it's incredibly important that people understand how this issue of Gaza also affects all of the local issues that are of concern to the community in Holborn and St Pancras, where I've lived for almost 23 years, but to communities around the United Kingdom. We spend tens of billions of taxpayers' pounds subsidizing the arms companies, BAE Systems, Kinetic, Rolls-Royce, even Elbit Systems, the Israeli arms manufacturer that has 7 factories in the United Kingdom. It used to be 10, but Palestine Action have forced the permanent closure of 3 of them. These tens of billions of pounds, along with our massive defense expenditure, which increases every year into the hundreds and hundreds of billions, along with the 209 billion pounds that we are spending on renewing our Trident nuclear missiles, this is money that should be invested in our communities, in the NHS, in schools, in helping develop youth services, in the building and maintenance of affordable, functioning housing for people who can't afford the incredibly expensive housing stock that predominates, in our care and benefit system, and of course in wages. So our economics are upside down at the moment. Our politics are upside down at the moment. And if we were spending less money subsidizing the weapons that are being used by Israel in Gaza, we would actually have more money to invest in the things that our communities so desperately need.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I just wanted to shift the conversation on. We're trying to sort of cover off as many issues as possible. You've endorsed, very kindly endorsed our list of policy pledges. And one of those pledges centers on security and counterterror, and particularly the definition of extremism that Michael Gove unveiled in Parliament in March.
Yeah.
What is your opinion of this definition? And were you elected as an MP, would you push for it to be overturned?
Well, first of all, to say that if there's one politician you don't want defining extremism, it's Michael Gove. But unfortunately, that's what we got. And that's just a reflection of the mediocre state of our politics, the intellectual vacuity of our politics in this country, the mendacity of our politics. You know, I remember a time when I used to visit this country when if a politician lied, that was the end of their career. Now it seems, unless you are a proficient liar, you almost can't have a career in politics. And that is profoundly and fundamentally wrong. The way in which security, national security, as well as local security, and counterterrorism have been used ever since the tragedy of 9/11 has been incredibly counterproductive to world peace and to unity amongst humanity on this planet. The reality is, in our response to 9/11, in our response to the recent events of 7th of October and Israel's response to that, we have placed this notion that we have a clash of civilizations, that we have a community, which is in itself many, many communities rather than one community, which is the Muslim community, which is the cause of all of these problems, the cause of threats to our nation. And the way in which that manifests is that Islamophobia is rife in our society. We also have problems with anti-Semitism, and we have problems with anti-Black racism. But it feels to me almost as if Islamophobia in this country is state-sponsored. And that is the way in the so-called Western world, since 9/11, that issues of security have played out, as though this is the fault of a community, in this case, the Muslim community. And I find that incredibly disturbing, but in addition to which it is completely counterproductive. You know, just as some people claim erroneously that the state of Israel represents all Jews, despite the fact that millions of Jews around the world and in Israel itself are actually vehemently opposed, in some instances to the very existence of the state of Israel, in other instances to the behavior of the government of the state of Israel. But there is still our commercial or mainstream media and our politicians trumpet this line that all Jews support Israel and what Israel does is supported by all Jews. Similarly, this notion that a tiny, tiny minority of people who are extremists in the real definitional sense of the word, that they in any way represent their community is a nonsense. Do I think that Minister Ben-Gvir, who frankly, in any normal functioning democracy, would have been jailed years and years ago for his incitement to the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, do I for 1 minute think that Ben-Gvir and his insane views represent the views of all Jews? I mean, this is a nonsense. And that all Jews therefore need to be re-educated in some way? Of course not. And that is why if there's a Muslim person who undertakes certain acts that the vast, vast majority of us would disagree with, holds ideological views that the vast, vast majority of us would disagree with, to suggest that that person represents the majority or even all Muslims is just an absurdity. So as an MP, I would actually fight for the sort of not just non-racism, but anti-racism that I was taught by Nelson Mandela and by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And at the core of that is that every single human being is equal, that every single human life is of equal value, and that we have far more in common across our various communities, however we define them, than we have differences. And we must focus on those commonalities, and we must celebrate those commonalities, but we must also celebrate our diversity and our difference. And that is something that we've done incredibly successfully in South Africa since 1994. We have many other challenges, but in terms of bringing people of different race groups, of different ethnicities, of different religions together, I believe we lead the world. And I would try and bring that exact same imperative to Parliament, and I would demand and speak out against all legislation that I believe discriminates against any one particular group on the basis of the views of an individual like Michael Gove, who I would argue whose instincts are exactly the antithesis of the anti-racism and tolerance that Mandela and Tutu taught us.
Thank you, Andrew. And I really like the way that you've kind of framed it, not just based on policy and legislation, but are actually advocating for a change in our political and social culture. I think that's so important. And as you've said, with Islamophobia, with other forms of racism, that's just become part and parcel of our society and of our politics. And unfortunately, we're seeing it played out in the elections. So on that note, sort of a further question around sort of this government and sort of some of the laws that it's recently brought in. So it's implemented various pieces of damaging legislation, such as the Public Order Act, for example, that are aimed at restricting protest and legitimate criticism of its policies. What are your thoughts on these measures?
Our politics in Britain are broken. Nothing has reflected that more than our current government, which is deeply corrupt, both morally and materially. But most importantly, politically, the spectrum has moved so far to the right that I would argue the Tories and people like Nigel Farage, the Reform Party, and even UKIP, which I didn't realize still existed until they turned up at a hustings in my local constituency recently, to argue against any form of immigration, and were then completely shocked when I explained to them that I'm an immigrant to this country. I think that our politics are in such a state because our politicians do not represent the people who they are elected to represent, that they represent their own interests and the interests of their billionaire donors and the companies associated with those donors. Now, how that manifests in terms of our politics It is unsustainable that Britain has more billionaires than at any time in this country's history. But at the same time, we have more people in our communities requiring to use food banks than at any time since the end of the Second World War. This is absurd, it is irrational and illogical, but the only way it can be sustained is if there is a clampdown on freedom of political speech, political thought, and political activity. And that is what we've seen in this legislation by the Conservative Party, first of all. We have seen an attempt to shrink the space that we have as citizens in a supposed democracy to speak our minds politically, personally, in terms of social justice. The attempt to close down the protests against a genocide in Gaza, describing them as hate marches, where they have been amongst the most celebratory, the most joyful, the most loving demonstrations that I have participated in anywhere in the world throughout my 60 years on this earth, says more about the corruption and immorality of our politics than it does about the marches themselves. Now, my real concern here is that the Labour Party under Keir Starmer behaves no differently. And if you look at Keir Starmer's professional record as the Director of Public Prosecutions, as our constituency MP for 9 years, and as leader of the Labour Party, where, just by the way, he has expelled more anti-racist Jews, supposedly to combat anti-Semitism, than in the entirety of the history of the Labour Party before his leadership. Now, to expel Jews to supposedly combat anti-Semitism would be like the ANC expelling Nelson Mandela in order to combat anti-Black racism. It makes no sense whatsoever. The fact that as Director of Public Prosecutions, Starmer did not allow the prosecution of any agent of the British state who committed crimes while doing their service, be it in the police or the military or the intelligence services, tells you so much about him. And it is my contention that as a politician, his instincts are profoundly undemocratic and authoritarian. And I actually fear that under a Starmer-led government, we will see even worse legislation and an even worse crackdown on our right to protest, our freedom of speech, our freedom of political thought and engagement in this country than we have seen under this appalling conservative regime. And that really, really terrifies me. And it's one of the reasons that I am standing against Keir Starmer in my home constituency of Holborn and St Pancras.
I mean, Andrew, yourself, you're one of sort of multiple independent candidates that are standing across the country that, may I say, have very much captured, the public imagination. You have Lian Mohammed in Ilford North, Faiza Shaheen in Chingford and Woodford Green, Sabir Alaka standing in Harrow East. There are a number of very inspirational kind of independent candidates, that are really taking this election by the scruff of the neck and are sort of repeating a lot of what you've said in terms of, the immorality of our politics and of our political class, of the main political parties. I mean, as an independent candidate, especially one standing against who could very well be the prime minister come the next election, depending, of course, on whether or not he actually wins the seat. What impact do you believe independent candidates can have in this election?
I think, and you've mentioned some of the incredible candidates, there's so many others we could mention as well. In the neighbouring constituency, Jeremy Corbyn, Pamela Fitzpatrick, Tanushka Mara, who is standing for one of the Brighton seats, another British Palestinian. I mean, we have extraordinary candidates across the country, and we're very lucky for that. And I think that we've already had an impact, and that we've already forced some of the candidates out of their comfort zone. I wrote a piece after about 10 days of the election, after it was called, about how the main parties are trying to eradicate Gaza from the election debate. because it is so embarrassing for them. We haven't allowed them to do that. And despite the mainstream or commercial media simply trumpeting the line of the Conservatives and the Labour Party in an almost nauseating way and trying desperately to avoid and ignore all of the independent candidates, I think on the ground, at the grassroots, on the doorstep, independent candidates across Britain have already had a huge impact. I've noticed how so many people, when I knock on the door and they look at me and then they look at the leaflet and they say, "This is you." And I say, "Yes." And they say, "Well, why are you coming to speak to me?" And I say, "What do you mean? I'm asking for your vote. I want to represent you. And how can I represent you if I'm not listening to your issues and concerns personally and working with you to resolve them?" And they say to me, "No, we agree, but we've never seen our MP. We've never seen our councillors. They've never come to talk to us." And people are almost shocked. So I think we're doing two things, at least three things. We're ensuring that the key issues that confront our communities, Gaza, the cost of living crisis, housing, education, the climate crisis, the sort of security legislation you've spoken about, the racism that is so apparent in our society today, we're at least giving people a little bit of hope amidst the darkness, that there are people prepared to stand for public office from their own communities, who are prepared to stand up for all these things and who won't go away after the 4th of July, whatever the outcome of the elections. But then I also think we're giving people a taste of what another sort of politics might be like. A politics in which a representative actually represents his or her community, in which they are accountable to that community. And I think that's very important. And regardless of the electoral outcomes on the 4th of July, every single MP who manages to win their seat, that has had a good, strong independent standing in their seat, is going to be looking over their shoulder. Because they will know, if they follow through on the policies that they're talking about at the moment, on this right-wing agenda adopted by the Labour Party, this far right-wing agenda adopted by the Conservatives and Reform and others, that they will have people who put their communities first, who put unity and solidarity over division. They will have us breathing down their necks. And next time in local elections and national elections, it might not be Andrew Feinstein standing, but it will be a representative of their community. And that is the most important thing that we will bring. What will that do for politics in places like Westminster after the 4th of July? Is that it will make them realize that there is a politics outside the bubble of Westminster, and they ignore it at their peril. Because what is going to happen after the 4th of July? Many of us who have stood as independents in many of our communities are committed to creating a new political movement in this country that might or might not become a new political party, a movement that has a totally different set of ethical and political principles and values to our mainstream politicians. And that is how we are going to change the structure and functioning of British politics going forward.
Thank you, Andrew. And sort of amidst some of the discussion today, which admittedly is quite depressing, quite taxing as well, it's brilliant to actually end on a positive note. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us.
Not at all. Can I just say one more thing
Yes.
in relation to that very quickly? And that is that I lived through enormous darkness in apartheid South Africa, even as a privileged white person. Because when your community dehumanizes another, you yourselves become dehumanized. But the reality is that we overcame apartheid in South Africa because of the will of the vast majority of South African people and tens of millions of sympathetic people around the world. And in just the same way as we achieved that, we will see a free Palestine. We will see a Britain where people actually feel represented by their politicians and their politics. But the only way we're going to see that is by the efforts of all of us as ordinary people in our communities, across the country and across the world.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.